It's a great honor to be standing here before you all and to be invited by the Al Hilal Student Club and the Students for Justice in Palestine Club to moderate this event on the topic of the question for Syria, what is next? Please let me start by introducing our three panelists. Today we have with us Dr. Mohammed Hosam Hafez, who has a PhD in international law and is a lecturer, lawyer, and former diplomat. He was a member of the Syrian opposition negotiation delegation of 2014 and the head of the legal bureau of the High Negotiations Committee between 2016 and 2017. He served as a Syrian diplomat in Tehran, London, Yerevan, and worked as a lawyer registered in the Damascus Bar Association. He has also taught as a professor of public international law and international humanitarian and human rights law in few academic institutions, including Qatar University. Today, we're also pleased to have with us Dr. Noha Aboueldahab, who's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. Her research focuses on transitional justice in the Arab region. Her book, Transitional Justice and the Persecution of Political Leaders in the Arab Region, a comparative study of Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, challenges mainstream transitional justice practices and scholarship using original material from interviews she conducted in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen between 2011 and 2017. Aboueldahab is also vice chair of the Transitional Justice and Rule of Law Interest Group at the American Society of International Law. She's a member of the Society of Legal Scholars, the Middle East Studies Association, the Law and Society Association, and the American Society of International Law. Last but not least, we have Dr. Jamal Elshayyal, who's an award-winning journalist. Did I pronounce it wrong?
No. You just gave me a PhD for free, so.
Well, then that's great. Who's an award-winning journalist and news producer, currently with Al Jazeera English. He's a graduate of London School of Oriental and African Studies. As a journalist, Jamal is not afraid to take risks to make sure that voices of the people he's reporting on are heard. In 2010, he was covering the Gaza flotilla when it was stormed by the Israeli Defense Forces. He also made a name for himself covering the Arab Spring, providing on-the-ground coverage from places including Egypt and Syria. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mohammed Hosam Hafez to the stage.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the Hilal Society and for Georgetown University for this kind invitation. And you will excuse me if you find my sound a little bit awkward because of this cold I'm having. So before having to start to have this analysis about the current situation in Syria and what we have as prediction for the future, let me just have a quick look about at the stages that the Syrian revolution had from the international relations and international law point of view. So the Syrian revolution started 2011. The first international text or decision was taken in 2011 was to do with humanitarian issues. And then we have the intervention of the Arab League, and we have troops sent to monitor the situation in Syria in 2011. And then 2012, we have the famous Geneva Communique, 30th of June 2012. Before that, we had the mass aggregation of the Syrian opposition in Cairo. Or in parallel with that produced two very important documents. Then we have like a stalemate for some time till we have the chemical attack on Ghouta 2013. 2013, that was a massive killing by the regime. Then the international community came again and introduced the very famous 2118 United Nations Security Council resolution to punish the regime, supposedly to strip the regime from the chemical weapons and to start a negotiation process, political process, that has started in 2014 in Geneva, when 42 countries came together to Montreux, and then they've had if you remember, very supportive stand with the Syrian opposition, and sympathizers were many among them for the Syrian revolution. 2014 had just 2 rounds of negotiations, but the beauty of which, or the distinguished features, were that it was a direct negotiations between the regime delegation and the opposition delegation. At that time, the opposition had just one entity representing most of the political factions, and some affiliated with the military faction as well on the ground. Just 2 rounds did not produce much. Then again, we had a very long period of stalemate till 2015, where everything started to change. 2015, we had the interference, the direct intervention of the Russian forces in Syria in September, and we had the understanding in 2 understandings between Kerry, the foreign minister, the American foreign minister at the time, with Lavrov, that produced a new strategy for the peace process in Syria. As a result, the Syrian opposition came together in Riyadh and produced a new delegation, or in fact, it produced the High Negotiation Committee as a political reference, and then the High Negotiation Committee produced or elect or appointed a delegation to start the negotiation with the regime. 2016-17, there were around 6 rounds of negotiations. All these rounds were proximity talks. There was no direct talks between the regime and the opposition. During the first 2 sessions, or two rounds of negotiation, there was the reality on the ground was there was a little of balance between the powers. The regime had started at the time campaigns to regain some territories, but still the opposition were very strong at the time, and the map was a bit, there was a balance between the powers. That changed in 2016, when the international scene and the regional scene started to change as well. The tipping point was Aleppo, when we lost Aleppo, when the opposition lost Aleppo 2016, and after that started the understanding between the Turks and the Russians. Then we had no balance of powers whatsoever on the ground. So the Turkish priorities shifted after the attempted coup, and they had new strategies. As a result, we had new realities for the Syrian opposition, namely the Astana process. The Astana process removed the claws of the opposition. They neutralized the military powers of the opposition, and so we have new strategies started by minimizing the effects on the ground of the military operations. The international community again came to, some of the international community came to aid the peace process So we had another rounds in 2017, but also it was there was no end result whatsoever. And again, we have a changing in the international circumstances when we have a new American administration that produced a new reality for the Syrian case, for the Syrian cause. After we lost the balance between the two, the regime and the opposition on the ground in terms of military operations, we lost the power on international political aid balance between the two. When the Americans started to speak about withdrawing troops from Syria, so after all of these talks, we lost any leverage in the peace process. Now, if we have a look at the current situation inside Syria, many of the commentators are saying that the regime has won the war, and in military terms, that's right. The regime has won the war by the aid of the Russians and the Iranians. That's right, to a great extent, but the regime is also having difficulty in running the daily business, daily life in Syria because of the presence of the Russians and Iranians. Although, in principle, they are not friends at all, the Russians and Iranians in Syria. They have a very competitive relationship, but still, they can't continue to be there without the cooperation and the help of each other. In terms of the strategic decisions, military decisions in Syria, we have the Russians, and in terms of the on-the-ground operations, we have the Iranians. So the Russians don't have much boots on the ground, so they have to compensate through the Iranians. In the time that Iranians don't have military equipment, so they have to aid the regime. That is also the regime is taking the aid of the umbrella of the Russians. So although the relationship between the Russians and the Iranians are not a very good one, but they have to cooperate to continue being in Syria for the time being at least. Also, in terms of the regime itself, the regime lost most of his military powers and is having very difficult times in covering all corners of Syria. The regime has shortage in personnel, in military personnel, because of the shortage and lacking of recruitment. Many, as you know, like half of the population went out of Syria, became refugees and or misplaced in Syria, and they are avoiding going to the military service. So the regime is having difficulty in that regard. So in this regard, the regime is trying to compensate by the militias and the paramilitias on the ground, most of which are Iranians or Iraqis. That is not the strategy for the Russians are not like are in opposition to this strategy, because they would like to have most of the refugees back to compensate for the manpower, and also to trying to achieve at least some conditions for the reconstruction of Syria for the international community. Each of Iran and Russia are trying to harvest the fruits of their intervention in Syria by being part of the destruction of Syria. However, they have totally different opinion on the ground in terms of how to run the state and how to allow or not allow the refugees to come back. However, the regime has another theory here, another strategy. The regime is trying to compensate by dividing the community, dividing the society, and by doing major demographic changes. the regime is trying to, and is doing that policy, in fact, on the ground, in Damascus, in Homs, in Deir ez-Zor. He wants to break the mass population from Arab Sunni background. So he does not want to see the scenes of 2011 again. So the only way is to divide the community by pouring in new elements from outside Syria, basically. At the same time, the regime is not having the same mechanisms that he used to have in the past. During Hafez al-Assad, mostly in the 90s, before and after, and then Bashar al-Assad, the son, the regime had basically three mechanisms to rule Syria. The first one is the military, the army and the security apparatus, then the government, the civil government, and then to some extent Hizb al-Ba'ath, the Ba'ath party. That was changed completely after Bashar al-Assad came to power, when there was a diminishing of the power for the Ba'ath party, and we have an enlargement of the intervention of military and security. Now we have the military have the upper hand in Syria, because for them they tried and they did their best to rid Syria from the conspiracy as they see it. So the military now in Syria having the upper hand, and they are controlling most of the areas, and we have now many new circumstances or new elements, new factors in the Syrian scene inside Syria under in the controlled regime-controlled areas. The war changed the economy altogether, so we have a new war economy still running in Syria inside the areas under the regime control. The army and to some extent the security officers now running their own like parts of their villages or neighborhoods in Damascus and around, and they're providing the daily basics for the people. So the civil government is not the one that is running the daily business in Syria, including providing the commodities and the basics for the people. It's now the military to some extent and the security. And Ba'ath Party became just one of the faction, one of the paramilitias or paramilitary entities in Syria. It lost its hegemonic power, it lost its reputation and character. So just to cut it brief, because it's apparently I talk too much time. The scenario that I see that is coming is continuation of the current scene, the current status quo. It's going to be for a longer period. We might see some changes here and there in terms of the local affairs, in terms of Idlib, and in the southern part of Syria as well. But I don't see any major changes, no game changes in terms of the politics, in terms of the central peace process that started some time ago. For example, we had a new delegation 2018. Till now, it's almost more than 1 year. We have they did not have any rounds of negotiations whatsoever. So we have delegations ready for negotiation, but we don't have negotiations because of the lack of the will from international community, the lack of interest from the American administration, and to be quite frank, the lack of vision from definitely the American administration and to some extent the international community. So we don't have much in the horizon in terms as big changes or game changes in Syria. One of the big elements that I guess it's gonna come to the scene is the war crimes and the legal part of the revolution, where the evidence that have been collected and accumulated against the regime now is bearing fruits in many corners around the world, in Europe, in France, in Germany, and I guess that will be the main development in the future, and that would bring Assad and his family to the justice, or at least that will make the price of protecting him in the long run for the Russians and for the Iranians much bigger than before. Thank you very much for listening to me.
My talk is going to focus on questions of justice in Syria, and I'd like to start with two questions. First, how do you pursue justice for mass atrocities while a war rages? And secondly, even once that war has ended, how do you pursue justice while a brutal dictator continues to reign? So to try and address these questions, I'd like to highlight three closely related aspects of the use and abuse of justice in Syria. So first, as the previous speaker just mentioned, the pursuit of prosecutions for alleged Syrian perpetrators in Europe through this mechanism known as universal jurisdiction. And secondly, the Syrian documentation movement. And third, the Syrian government's so-called reconciliation agreements and the death notices that it issued last year for 800 forcibly disappeared Syrians. Some of you may have noticed the news a couple of weeks ago when 3 Syrians were arrested in Germany and France. They used to work for the Secret Service or the Mukhabarat, and they've been charged with torture and killings of Syrian detainees. And last year, Germany issued an international arrest warrant for Jamal Hassan. And this was huge news, right? Because he headed the Syrian Air Force intelligence. And the charges there are crimes against humanity and war crimes for overseeing the torture and murder of hundreds of Syrians. And then, of course, there are multiple other cases throughout Europe, in several European countries. So given the brutality of the war in Syria, and the difficulties in obtaining material that meets certain legal thresholds to conduct proper investigations and to pursue criminal cases, these arrests and investigations are a big deal. But there are difficult questions that remain. For those high-ranking Syrian officials who remain inside Syria, will they ever be arrested? But at the same time, we can ask the question, does it matter if they're arrested, or is the arrest warrant itself sufficient to name and shame and limit their mobility for fear of getting arrested on their trips? Look at, for example, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who has had an arrest warrant hanging on his head for almost 10 years now from the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. Sure, he may have limited the number of destinations on his travels, but he continues to rule the country, and he's received by heads of state in Africa and Asia, and indeed here in the Middle East. Apparently, he's been on more than 150 trips since the ICC issued arrest warrants against him. And one of those trips, of course, was to Syria last December, making al-Bashir the first Arab leader to do so since the Syrian war started. The symbolism of that trip is not lost on anyone. But on the subject of the ICC, China and Russia vetoed a Security Council resolution that would have referred Syria to the ICC. And that same Security Council is the reason that Omar al-Bashir has these ICC arrest warrants against him. And that same Security Council didn't even entertain the idea of referring Yemen to the ICC for the crimes being committed by the 27 countries involved in that war. And that same Security Council gladly and swiftly referred Libya to the ICC. Now, of course, this is all realpolitik, very unsurprising, but it has some very real consequences for justice. But in a smart move following this Security Council veto for Syria, the General Assembly kind of circumvented that and established the IIIM, I think it's Independent International Impartial Mechanism for the Collection of Evidence. It's got a horribly long name, but basically the establishment of the IIIM was hailed as this landmark, unprecedented move. And its purpose is to collect evidence for future prosecutions. And then, of course, we also have the Commission of Inquiry for Syria. Now, none of these prosecutions and none of these international mechanisms would be able to function properly if it weren't for Syrians who document. Many of you, I'm sure, know about the incredible documentation movement that's led by Syrians, where you have lawyers, activists, defectors, civil society actors, victims, documenting violations since the start of this war, and also a lot of them have been filing these cases in Europe, Mazen Darwish and Anwar al-Bunyar among several of them. So this incredible documentation movement is very diverse. So you have professional documenters, but you also have ordinary Syrians documenting. So while some international lawyers frown upon this because they're concerned that the procedures that these documenters are following are not necessarily up to par with so-called international legal standards, I think that this critique overlooks the power of this victim and survivor-led movement to document. But also, and I'll come back to that, but also who from the IIIM or the Commission of Inquiry and these other international mechanisms would station themselves long-term in places such as Homs or Idlib or Daraa, etc., to collect evidence according to international legal standards. Sure, of course, you need evidence that meets these thresholds in order to conduct a proper criminal investigation. But this documentation movement does not only serve the purpose of prosecutions, it's also become a very powerful form of resistance. Resistance to the farcical security narrative, which prioritizes an equally farcical notion of peace and stability at the expense of justice, but also resistance to resurgent authoritarianism and resistance to the authoritarian regimes that preceded 2011 and those that came after it. So the documentation movement is essentially resistance to the hijacking of history and of narratives, which brings me to my third point. So this hijacking of history is happening before our very eyes on a daily basis. We know that the Syrian government issued these fake death notices last year for 800 Syrians who were forcibly disappeared. Many of the notices state that the cause of death was cardiac arrest, dehydration, and other natural causes. And these death notices were only for 800 Syrians, and estimates of the number of forcibly disappeared Syrians are between 80,000 to 90,000. So think about this for a minute. If the student body here at Georgetown, as I'm told, is 250 students, that's the equivalent of 360 Georgetown campuses. So that's 90,000 families who continue to suffer from this heinous crime of not even knowing if their loved ones are dead, alive, or alive and getting tortured on a daily basis. And this was and continues to be the case in parts of Latin America. So for example, more than 30 years ago in Argentina, there were about 30,000 Argentinians who were forcibly disappeared by the brutal military dictatorship that was in power there. Their relatives, their mothers, their grandmothers, and other relatives continue to protest to this very day on a weekly basis in Buenos Aires to demand information about the fate of their relatives. Every now and then you hear these heartwarming but also very heartbreaking stories about some of them getting reunited. And this may very well be the case in Syria decades from now. So we've also seen the Syrian government's attempts to steal land and property, and the made-up charges that Syrian refugees who have come back to Syria are forced to sign in these so-called reconciliation agreements. These reconciliation agreements were basically meant to, as an amnesty process, whereby Syrians who return would have to register with their local security authority within 6 months in return for not getting prosecuted and generally just being left alone. Now, of course, these agreements turned out to be a farce and a form of intimidation and a tool for arbitrary detention. So here you have the latest examples of how the Syrian government and many other governments in this region for that matter, of how they use law to repress their subjects. These death notices and reconciliation agreements are legal documents, and they're both framed by the Syrian government as a gesture to move on from the dark past. So the language and the tools of justice, and in particular of reconciliation, are used to bury any attempts for a proper reckoning with the past in Syria. But this is why the documentation movement is central to transitional justice in Syria. When I say transitional justice, I mean it in the broadest sense, basically addressing the past, a painful past. The documentation movement is not only a means of collecting evidence to be used in the future, but as I said, it's a form of resistance to these ongoing crimes and these legalized injustices that the Syrian regime continues to perpetrate. Now, of course, documentation has always been integral to moving transitional justice processes along, but the Syrian example shows that it's a lot more than that. It shows that documentation is a way to preserve history. As one Syrian civil society leader told me, preserving history is a form of accountability. So to add to this, the documentation can be pursued in the immediate term without having to wait for a political transition to take place or even for conflict to subside. It's also a movement that draws the participation of Syrians inside Syria and those who fled and the more established diaspora. So I think that this is very empowering for victims, for their families, and for civil society, whose expectations of transitional justice are repeatedly dashed by this counter-revolutionary assault that much of the region suffers from. So if we think about justice in this way, when we look at the difficult contexts of conflict and renewed authoritarianism, I think that the justice expectations of victims can evolve. And understandably, they seek a rapid and retributive justice. And I think that despite the brutality of the conflict in Syria, the pursuit of prosecutions in Europe, and the ways in which Syrians have been documenting what is now the most documented war in history, opens up opportunities and possibilities for the future of justice, not just in Syria, but for others in the region as well. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to participate in these events. My participation tonight is maybe a little different in the sense that my background isn't an academic one, so it may not be as smart as what you guys have just heard, but hopefully you may find some benefit in it. I want to start off by saying a phrase and then maybe we'll come back to it. And it is my belief that you cannot change reality unless you change the rules of the game. And we'll come through this when we start talking about how I viewed things unfolding in Syria in terms of my reporting there, not only inside Syria, but also through the different processes that have taken place, the political ones, be it Astana or Geneva or other ones. I think it's important to, when we come to try and figure out what's next, or to ask what will happen, is to first figure out what has happened, right? You cannot try and predict or to look to the future without understanding the past. And right now, I think that's the first struggle. There is currently a narrative that has been pushed for several years now that seems to be a dominant one. Noha referred to it, but it really does need a lot of effort to rectify, which is this narrative that what is taking place in Syria is a war against so-called terrorism, that there was a need for international intervention in order to combat a group that nobody had heard of and then suddenly just appeared controlling swathes of lands in Syria and Iraq, namely Islamic State. And that suddenly the only time the international community was able to agree on anything was to counter this. The reality of the fact is completely different. The reality is that in 2011, young Syrians protested initially demanding reform. They were met by probably or arguably the most brutal regime in the Arab world, and maybe even in the world at the time. And the way in which they were treated essentially gave rise to widespread protests, which very quickly then started demanding for complete overthrow of a regime that had been in power for decades and had done nothing for the country. And when the orders came in to essentially massacre people en masse, there were some who had a moral compass which directed them towards defecting from the Syrian military, and thus the Free Syrian Army was born out of that. And that quickly then became into an armed conflict, but not one between terrorist militia who were trying to target innocent people, but one between armed groups that were trying to protect protesters and an army that was trying to prop up a regime, either because of its sectarian alliances or because of the regional support it was given, or even the international support it was given by Russia or Iran and so forth. So it's important to look at that narrative first. And why I say this, because then you understand the root cause of the crisis. There may have then developed other issues that have confounded the crisis, but the root cause of the crisis in Syria is much the same as the root cause of the crisis in Egypt, in Libya, Yemen, and other places in the Arab world. And it very simply is summed up into the awakening of a large section, I'm not going to say all, because the reality is there is still large sections of the Arab world who do not want this, but the awakening of a large section of Arab society that wants freedom, that wants self-determination, that believes they have a right to life, not a right to survival. Believes that they have a right from their governments to actually improve their well-being, to elevate them, not necessarily that they are only there to get a job, and so long as there's a roof over their head, then it's okay, we will just adhere to whatever our government or our military establishment or our monarchy says. We understand that as a root cause. We then look into identifying the different roles that were played over the years in order for us then to go into the responsibilities, which a large part of that will go into seeking justice, and then after that looking at lessons, roles and responsibilities. What makes Syria maybe more unique than the other countries that we mentioned in the Arab world, obviously, is that there are maybe more players that are directly involved. So with Syria, you have obviously Assad and his family, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, you have Turkey, you have to some extent Qatar, you have the United States, and you have the opposition, of which there is many different factions within it, from let's say the Islamist-oriented ones like the Muslim Brotherhood to more liberal or secular ones and so forth. In each one of those, and that's even before we get into also within the opposition of the armed groups and so forth, and before we even discuss the other armed groups that suddenly were created in order to be a smokescreen or a diversion to what has taken place. The roles that were played by each one of those, again, needs to be identified. I mean, there are some that were very clear, and possibly the most brutal of them were the most honest. Ironically. So, for example, when you think of Assad or you think of the Russians, from day one it was very clear what they had. Assad is staying in power at all costs, by any means necessary, and there's no budging. And Russia and Assad did not shift a centimeter from the beginning. In fact, they dug their heels down more. They used every possible tool at their disposal and then some to essentially obliterate any possibility of changing things. So there was never a time where you would hear Bashar al-Ja'fari or any person from the Syrian regime even entertain the idea that Assad would not be in power, even if it were for a transitional period. There was never a time where the Russians would ever accept something like that. Whereas, for example, if you look at some parts of the opposition, or at least maybe some of the countries that were allegedly supporting it, they would waver, or they would come out with different statements which would allow for that survival to continue. Dr. Hosam gave a very detailed timeline of some of the events that took place. And I remember, for example, 2013, prior to the first mass reported use of chemical weapons, there was the statements coming out of the United States that this was a red line, we would never allow for this to happen, and so forth. I remember having a private discussion with the prime minister of one of the regional countries, or actually at the time he was with the Turkish foreign minister, and he relayed to me a story where when this took place, he was in London at the time, and he had received a phone call from the Americans, and they had agreed that the line had been crossed and that there was a need for military intervention to protect the people of Syria. However, the Americans, through John Kerry, had requested that it would be the Turks who would call for it because the Americans were still wary post-Iraq and Iraq unilateral, or what appeared to be in reality unilateral intervention or an occupation of Iraq. And therefore, it was Turkey's responsibility to demand for this, and then the Americans would follow suit. And the Prime Minister, or the Foreign Minister, Dawood at the time, had an interview with the BBC from London where he clearly stated that there was now a need for the international community to intervene. The deal was the Americans would then come out and there would be a statement made by the Obama administration following that to corroborate it and then talk about it. That statement never came, according to the story that was narrated to me, to which the Turks then called the Americans, and Kerry said, well, it seems that there isn't the political will, is how it was described, to follow through. Why I bring up this story, not only to show the kind of different shifting stances of the different political powers, but also that whilst all of this is going on, there was never any equilibrium in this conflict. There was never any balance of power, and that is something that ultimately the people who have paid the price for is the Syrian people. Identifying those responsibilities and who was responsible for what, not only domestically within Syria, but also regionally and internationally, is important. Talking about, for example, the loss of Aleppo and the shift that Turkey took following that as a direct result of the instability or insecurity felt by the Turkish government post the failed coup attempt. The Turks will say, well, we tried our best, we've welcomed so many million refugees, and to be fair, Turkey has probably done more for the Syrian people than any other country did, but it also positioned itself as the savior of the Syrian people, and with that comes a responsibility that requires to be at least addressed. One of the important things, again, looking at when we ask ourselves what's next, is also understanding the interconnectivity of Syria. And by that, I mean the interconnectivity regionally speaking. Again, to my first point, when I spoke about what happened in Syria not being different from other countries, this is primarily important. It's very good that this event has been co-organized by the Student for Justice in Palestine, because my belief is that with each country of the Arab Spring, there was an intrinsic link between those calling for justice and freedom and their belief in the fact that the oppression that they have been experiencing is directly corroborated with the fact that there has been a constant effort by the international community and Western powers to ensure that there are governments or regimes in the Arab world that would ensure the safety and well-being of Israel at the expense of everything else. So as much as Assad would like to claim that he was some sort of resistance axis or whatever he says to himself towards Israel, he never once actually reciprocated or responded to any attack that the Israelis themselves committed on Syria. The Golan Heights remained occupied, and he would always use this as just an excuse to try and garner support. The belief amongst many in the Pentagon and as well as other Western powers is that if there was to be some sort of freedom or free elections or self-determination in Arab countries, then that born out of that would come governments that would start demanding for the rights of Palestinians, that would start demanding for the return of refugees, that would start demanding for an end to the illegal occupation. And this is something where, again, you could find the international community aligning on, regardless of their differences differences in terms of their colonial agendas to the region, that it was important to ensure that at all costs none of these uprisings or revolutions would succeed in order to benefit the Israelis. And this has also been documented in the past year. There have been articles and other pieces that have come out that have shown that the Israelis expressed that it was their belief it was much better for them that Assad remains in power than for him to be overthrown. Lessons that should have been learned and haven't been learned, but still we look at, for example, when we think about the future, again, there's a difference between what I think will happen and what I hope or wish would happen. In reality, there is a lot like what has happened post-invasion and occupation of Iraq, which I believe will continue in Syria, in the sense that you will have the daily instability, you will have the daily violence, maybe at a smaller scale than the civil war itself has taken place, but you will continue to have a country that is divided between different regional and international powers. It will not essentially recover whilst it is under that occupation, be it Russian occupation, Iranian occupation, or others. And this then comes on to the idea of what I call the pieces process and not the peace process, because the idea behind it, especially Astana, was essentially to divide up Syria, whether people like to admit it or not. The Turks were given a certain part to control or to have an influence on, the Russians theirs, the Iranian were given leverage in certain areas, and the American to some extent, encouraged by the Saudis who were demanding America to be present in order to counter Turkish influence in the region, also were given theirs. And that's why it was very difficult to see that this process was anything but disingenuous, because if there was any real intention to find peace, then the international community would have been a lot firmer. For example, we look at Venezuela now, for example, and the statements that are being made against Maduro and the sanctions that have been put in place and so forth. Compare that to the destruction of Syria, the displacement of millions of Syrians, the killing of at least 500,000, if not more, Syrians, and not even a fraction of what has happened or what has been said or the movement has taken place. So, coming back to it, why I was saying the first statement of you can only change the reality if you change the rules of the game. I believe maybe without coming too hard down on the opposition, I think one of the things we noticed when I was looking at the role of the opposition to a certain extent was that they allow, and this not only in Syria, by the way, this is, or let's say the pro-revolution forces, not only in Syria, this is across the countries, was they allowed for themselves to continue playing by the rules that were being set by those dominant powers, right? So you go to negotiations, yes, you need to go. You need recognition. The only way you can get recognition, opposition, is if you kind of make concessions on certain things. But there was no concessions being made on the other side, right? And I think that that is one of the mistakes that were being played, that they fell into. And in order for a new reality to emerge, whereby you have a region which truly is able to secure some sort of freedom and self-determination for it, those who are calling for that revolution or calling for that change need to stop adhering to the customs and norms of international diplomacy that have been set, because they aren't customs and norms as much as they are essentially shackles that have been put in place in order to maintain a world order that in reality the vast majority of the people in the region have continually suffered under. Thank you.
Okay, let me first start by asking you a question. You mentioned in your talk, you touched upon the intervention by the West in Syria when it came to chemical weapons and in different instances. My question really has to do with the right to protect. So the Western countries have claimed that they're using their right to protect to intervene in Syria, given the humanitarian conditions there. While the Russians have argued that the Syrian case does not meet the conditions in international agreements that have to do with the right to protect. What do you think about that?
Thank you. Very interesting question. The thing is, most of the international community intervention in Syria was not based on humanitarian legal basis. Folks, the Russians, as you said, are claiming that they have the invitation from, between quote unquote, the legitimate regime. The United States, for example, is there because they are fighting terrorism. If we mention, for example, the letter that the U.S. representative in the UN sent to the other members of the Security Council, she was highlighting that the regime in Syria is not capable or is not able or not willing to fight terrorism. That's why we have to go in and fight ISIS and other organizations. So it's not humanitarian based at all. Other countries that have the coalition with the US are also having this on other legal basis, basically fighting terrorism and trans-border violence and terrorism. So it's the only resolutions to United Nations Security Council resolutions was to deliver aid in Syria. So there was no military green light for them to go in because of the divided nature of the Security Council. And regarding the right to protect, they did not invoke it whatsoever in their resolution. So the right to protect, there's no international agreement as per se saying that in order to protect, you have the right to go in order to protect civilians. It's embedded in other kind of legal themes and legal doctrines. But unfortunately, there was no political will to stimulate and to act as humanitarian protectors based on international law in the Syrian case.
Noha, Dr. Mohammed touched upon this in his remarks, and you did towards the end of your remarks as well, that the way ahead is that there's potential for persecutions in the West against Bashar al-Assad, and this might be one of the ways to put pressure on the al-Assad regime. While early on in the beginning of your remarks, you mentioned al-Bashir and the warrant that was issued by the ICC. To what extent do you think that the persecutions or the cases against Bashar al-Assad in international courts and against him by international organizations as well could actually lead or materialize to anything, basically?
I don't think it will. Like as it stands now, and as I mentioned in my talk, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is not really an option. It was vetoed. There has been talk of establishing an international tribunal. But even then, a specialized one for Syria, but even then, who will arrest Bashar al-Assad and have him physically transferred to wherever this tribunal will be? That said, I think that it's not all doom and gloom. Sometimes, these things take decades, right? A lot can change. And I think that this is why I was talking about expectations. I think it's important to look at criminal justice as a process, as opposed to this immediate, outcome. And it's very difficult for victims, of course, who want to see officials such as Bashar al-Assad in prison. So I guess my answer is it's not looking great, but there are other ways of thinking about justice, and this is why the documentation movement is so crucial to sort of preserve all of this material. There are other avenues as well, like truth commissions. Now, of course, with the current state in Syria, truth commission is not going to be, any truth commission that's established is not going to be credible. But this doesn't preclude the possibilities of these avenues in the future.
Jamal, you've been someone who was there on ground in Egypt and in Syria. 8 years on now since the Arab uprisings erupted in 2011. Who do you think has learned more from the lessons of the Arab uprisings and their repercussions? Is it regimes or the people?
The unfortunate answer is the regimes. To be honest, I don't think the people have learned. And I think that's because I mean, firstly, knowledge is power, right? So understanding, and one of the reasons why the people or these regimes have been able to remain in power is that they have systematically ensured the ignorance of the masses throughout their rule, right? So if you look at, for example, Egypt, 30 or 40 years ago, people would travel the world to study at its universities. Right now, the primary education in Egypt is literally the worst, according to UNICEF, the worst in the world, right? And this is something that's significant in the sense that it does have the ability to understand what's going on. So the conspiracy theories that were put forward by the regimes, the kind of defaming of those who are actually trying to maybe improve the situation in the Arab world and making them seem as satanic is something that was successful because of this. But also, I think there is something in the old saying of divide and rule, which is something that the regimes also participated in, was ensuring that if you look at the high points of all of the uprisings, they were always when there was a united front by different political inclinations who were agreed on the fact that there was a need for freedom and a need for change. And the low points were always when there was that disunity, and Syria is no difference. When 2012, 2013, when you're talking about Assad barely controlling 10 to 15% of the country, you had unison between the different armed factions, between the different political parties to a great extent. But then suddenly thrown into the works was issues of who would be responsible head of the opposition, even though it had no real power on the ground, or which armed groups should be given more arms by different countries, and who would be leading, and who would be responsible for different areas within Syria. And whilst maybe on a day-to-day that may have seemed important or significant, but in reality, so long as you are all still under occupation or under that oppression, it meant nothing unless you got rid of that. So there was definitely an awakening amongst, I mean, if you call it the Arab awakening, there was definitely awakening amongst the regimes that unless they acted, their days in power were numbered, and they've definitely learned a lot more than I think the masses have.
Nowadays, as you see, there are many coups that occurred in many Arab countries. And if we look back into the Syrian history, we could notice that Hafez al-Assad came through a coup. Do you think that the crisis occurring now in Syria could occur in other Arab countries? My question is to Jamal.
So, just so I can make sure I answer, you're asking, do I believe that the crisis that's occurring right now in Syria, if it could happen in other countries in terms of an armed crisis, right? So I think that's something that's been talked about a lot, and to be honest, those who have been warning about it have been more so the regimes than the people. So for example, in Egypt, whenever there's been a call for change, recently it's been the response by the regime is, oh, would you want us to be like Syria and Iraq? Similarly in Libya and similar other countries as well. There is something in what I would call the self-realized prophecies, right? So just because I'm warning against it, it doesn't mean I don't want it. And I think what the regimes have done purposefully is to make these self-realizations happen in order to justify their existence. The reality, like I say, it's important to go back to the narrative. 2011, when people took to the streets, it wasn't the people who started shooting up. It wasn't the people who asked the Iranians to send in militia. It wasn't the people who asked the Russians to send in weapons. The people were simply asking for more freedom and reforms. They didn't even start by asking for Assad to go, actually. And therefore, there is sole responsibility for what happened in Syria to then become a civil war and then a regional war, and the destruction that has taken place, that firmly is laid on the doorstep initially of Bashar al-Assad and then all those who supported him. Can it happen in other countries? Of course it can happen in other countries, because the powers that be, if they wish to flood the areas of those countries and start propping up organizations or groups or setting them up. Let me tell you a story. If we all remember, right before, it was just when the international coalition to fight ISIS was established, there was what happened in Kobani or Ain al-Arab, right? Kobani is a small town on the border on the Syrian side of the Turkish-Syrian border. I went to report. I was on the Turkish side. We took, there's some hills surrounding it, and it's a few hundred meters there. Anybody who's been in that area knows that all of these areas, they're like farmland, so they're like flat. You can see kind of throughout. And we were on a hilltop on the other side looking over those fields. And I had a former British SAS soldier with me. A lot of the times when journalists go, they have like security personnel just to see. And we were there for a good few days, and we're monitoring these aircrafts that was done, that were essentially allegedly bombing ISIS targets there. Now, at that time, and we had gone to the displacement camps that were inside Turkey, the Turks had registered something around 180,000 that had gone inside. The population of Kobani was registered to be around 200,000. So at most, let's imagine that only people who fled Kobani went to Turkey and nobody fled to other places, that there was maximum 20,000 people there, which again is unrealistic, but let's say for argument's sake. Now, anybody who saw how the Americans participated or undertook their military operations in Iraq, for example, when you think of Fallujah and other places, their MO is to carpet bomb places. They don't really care. If they believe there is Al-Qaeda or if there is ISIS and so forth, they go in with full force. But what we were noticing were, and he had his binocular, we had everything there looking at it and filming, that there were these bombing campaigns or whatever you want to call it, missions taking place, where they were targeting literally empty fields. And I asked him, what I can see is that they're attacking empty fields. And he said to me, well, and we monitored and we filmed, and there was very little being targeted inside Kobani. And what appeared to be a show to the international community that had gathered on the other side to say, oh, we're targeting. And this, for me, was the pivotal point of turning the narrative and getting the international community to start focusing on this. So the reality is, unfortunately, if it comes to a point where it becomes evident that on the ground the people genuinely are calling for change and that the regimes are unable to hold back those tides of people and the waves of people asking for change, then yes, very quickly you can get regional powers or the international community suddenly deciding to, okay, let's turn this from an uprising to a civil war.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for taking your the time today to come and talk to us over here. I have two questions, and the first one is directed towards Dr. Hosam. Considering the apparent interest of Israel in the Iranian presence in Syria, whether it be through the airstrikes or whatnot, do you believe that the region may be drifting towards an even bigger conflict between Israel and Iran? Your second. Okay, the second question is directed towards Mr. Jamal. So you mentioned that the opposition would need to change the rules of the game in order to have any real effect. So how exactly can the opposition do that, and what options are available while the opposition has essentially lost its influence and power on the ground and has been divided into numerous factions? Thank you.
To my mind, I don't think that there are going to be a major military operation between Israel and Iran in the near future. I guess what we've been seeing and what I predict to see is just a very contained environment of conflict between Iran to demonstrate their presence in Syria, and because Israel has some problems with the military presence of the Iranians in Syria. Iranians in Syria mostly are now within the fabric of many communities inside the main cities. So it's not really, you can't recognize their military presence there. So Israel can't go and bomb them. So Israel is having some problems with very flagrant military presence in some places, and Iran understands that. But from time to time, Israel will bomb basically some military outpost here and there, but I don't think that will is candidate for more escalation. Thank you.
In terms of options for the opposition, I think it's more, you have to think now more long term. And this, again, I think applies more so to the region, but seeing as we're discussing Syria right now, these are rounds of change. I don't think change happens overnight. And I think maybe one of the mistakes that everybody fell into, maybe at the time when we saw the changes happening in 2011, there was maybe this belief, or maybe even it was a subconscious wish that suddenly everything was going to change, everything was going to be better. You can't reverse decades of colonialization or oppression or ignorance and corruption within 18 days or a year or two. And I think it takes processes and even possibly generations for that to happen. And that's where I think it's important, whether it be education or understanding what's happened, but also the ideas of transitional justice and also identifying key areas where societies can improve and strengthen. So what I would say right now, it is pretty much going back to the drawing board, but for people to start realizing, and I think maybe one of the benefits, so I don't sound too pessimistic, I think there have been positives that have come out of the Arab uprising, that there is, especially amongst young Arabs, now more of a concern with their day-to-day lives, that they are more engaged to a certain extent. Of course, there are elements of society that have maybe drifted to extremes, but generally speaking, there is more of a concern to start thinking about their future in a better way.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for Georgetown to hold this is one decision or sections, because it's very important for us. My question is, Syrian people is destroyed for everything, and still Bashar al-Assad kill no stop. There is no any hopes or wish from all the people, all worlds, big world, to stop Bashar al-Assad or remove it, and we have government clean to catch Syria and help the people to solve this one problem, not now, in near or future. Thanks. That's my question.
I guess we've been witnessing some very lazy international community, very reluctant international community that did not intervene when Bashar al-Assad was massacring his own people by chemical weapons. So I don't see it in the future. As I said in my talk, any game changer in that regard. However, I guess we have to rely on the people. I mean, the awareness that the Arab people had during the Arab Spring will not go back to the same starting point. Look what's happening in other places. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we have won the war and in civil or military terms, but still the Arab peoples now are much more aware of their rights and their future. Look what was going on now in other places. In Sudan, for example, the regimes are acting as if they've been students in the same school, always raising the flags of international conspiracy, and then the military came to the scene and threatening the people of that is not the time for such acts, for demonstration and so on and so forth. But the peoples are in the street. It's very, very difficult to see the future without this kind of awareness. But we don't have to rely anymore. I mean, the Arab peoples and the Arab the revolutionaries in the Arab world have been taught a lesson by the international community not to rely on that kind of slogans anymore.
Thank you very much. That was very informative speak. My question is for Dr. Noha and also for Dr. Hosam. So Dr. Noha, we were seeing lately, the ending of ISIS, right? And we were having this debate about whether they should be shipped back to their countries, especially the foreign fighters and ISIS brides, quote unquote. My question to you is within the context of Syrian, and then let's have the HTS in Idlib. How do you see, or what do you think that the type of social justice between militias among each other? We know that we should persecute Assad for his atrocities, but what about how can we, document the atrocities between the militias, the armed groups between themselves, and also the HTS atrocities, because they have been doing a lot of atrocities, and then link it back to what's happening in ISIS. Are those fighters should be, tried in Syria, in their countries, or there should be another international court? And then my question to Dr. Hosam is, Let's entertain the scenario, and I'm not sure if the Syrian opposition did. Let's assume that, nothing is going to change, as you said, and then we're going to go for elections, and we will go for writing the constitution, whatever that means. What is the opposition doing at this moment to enter these alleged elections? What is the opposition vision if that scenario unfolds? Thank you.
There's a lot to be said about local justice processes, if we can call it, but in the broadest sense. So you asked about prosecutions with these militias and so forth. I think it's important to look, not to dismiss prosecutions, but to sort of pause it right now and think about other ways to achieve some form of accountability, especially because in the case of Syria and in the case of many other countries in the region, it's impossible to have a fair and effective prosecution domestically. It would have been ideal, it would have been better to have a domestic prosecution than to have one that's conducted internationally. But right now, that's just it's not a viable option. That doesn't mean that those communities that have been directly affected by these atrocities can't do anything right now. Documentation, coming back to my earlier point, is something that can be done right now, and it is being done by Syrians inside and outside of Syria. I think that hopefully as things at least as the violence perhaps eases a little bit in some of these communities and towns, you can start to see some local sort of efforts geared towards some form of reconciliation, whether it's, a truth commission that's very, very, very localized. But at the same time, having said that, I think a central sort of process at the national level is equally important, but it's just not a viable option at the moment. But as I said, there are many other initiatives that can be pursued in the immediate term.
I would like to comment on the first question before I come to the second. I don't think there's any problem of prosecuting the international elements, the foreign elements who've been fighting in Syria under the banner of Daesh or Tahrir al-Sham or others when the war ended, because the international community, the all services, the all intelligence services around the world will hunt them and haunt them, and they will be brought into justice. But that does not apply to the regime. Take an example of the 3 officers that have been captured in Europe. 3 of them, at least 2 of them, they have defected 2012, and they have been of great help of the opposition. One of them was sort of an advisor for the opposition delegation 2014, and yet the international community, international organization for transitional justice picked these 2 up and brought them to. It's not. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, look what happened. The defected officers brought to justice, while we have dozens, maybe hundreds in Europe and, of course, around the world from the regime that they've not been approached at all. Regarding your second question, the opposition are divided on this issue, on the issue of participating in the Constitutional Committee and beyond that, the elections and whatever coming after. For example, I myself, I see the Constitutional Committee as a trap for the opposition. Once we have a presence there, we will give legitimacy for the regime and for the coming election, where the only capable candidate is Assad. The opposition and the other factions, they don't have the means for political movement, for political to come together and to form in this very short period of time political parties and so on and so forth, because of the long time of oppression and submission by the regime. We don't have any political proper political parties in Syria. So when it comes to the elections, I don't see any other means than boycotting it, or at least to change the rules of the game. But if we are willing to be part of it, that will give legitimacy, I guess, for Bashar al-Assad and the regime. Other opposition members, some of which at least some of them are willing to participate. They are arguing that if we leave this opportunity, maybe we'll never have another opportunity. So as I mentioned before, it splits as division between the political opposition.
My name is Ayman. So my question is, we've seen how Russia and Iran has interfered in Syria, and right now, even though Bashar al-Assad is the president of Syria, he's just as a puppet, where basically the people who are controlling Syria are Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And as a result, the thing got out of control of the Syrians, because even if they want to go against Bashar, it's not even in the hands of Bashar al-Assad to make any changes. It's mostly with those countries who are occupying the Syrian state. So how is it going to be in the future? How could people, or how could Syria restore its sovereignty or power against all those occupational powers in its lands?
I guess the answer is the political change, the political transition. That will take time, of course, as long as the regional, Iran and Russia are seeing Bashar al-Assad as the only focal point for their interaction in Syria, and as long as they don't have alternative, they will support Bashar al-Assad. But there will be a time that the burden of protecting this dictator will be much more than the price that they are willing to pay. So, I guess, and now we are witnessing and hearing always rumors or sometimes information about the competition between the two countries inside Syria, grooming up some officers in intelligence services or in the army that lenient towards this and that. So I guess there will be a time. We don't have any means now. The Syrian opposition is very weak. We don't have any leverage on the ground. That's the reality. But it's very unlikely, I guess, for at least the medium term, that Bashar al-Assad will stay the answer, will stay the key figure for protecting the interest of all of these factions, all of these powers, regional powers, and Russia as a superpower in Syria for a long run.
Just to add, I think it's important to note something. Firstly, there's something maybe which we fail to give credit to, which is the reality is those who have been calling for change in Syria have been doing so against essentially the entire world, right? So when you think about it, against the Americans, against the Israelis, against obviously the regime, against Russia, against Iran, and so forth. And that in itself, the fact that whilst the fact of the matter is on the ground, they've lost militarily, but for it to have sustained itself as a revolution or a call for change for so long is something impressive, considering the imbalance in power that is taking place. What's significant, or what's important to the Syrian people must start asking themselves is not who are they against, but what are they for? So imagine anyway, Bashar al-Assad was removed yesterday. I personally don't believe that the Russians or the Iranians care for Bashar al-Assad because his name is Bashar al-Assad or for who he is. It is what he represents that's important, representing a regime that will do things at the behest of them, that represents a minority and so forth. What's ironic is that the Iranian regime and the Iranian people should be the first to have actually supported the Arab revolutions and not been against it, because when the Iranian people decided to rise up against the government or a monarchy represented in the Shah, which was not doing what the people wanted, or at least the majority of people wanted there, and were calling for freedom, they were able to secure it. So actually, if they were to be true to their history and to what the Iranian Republic is essentially allegedly founded on, then they should have been first in line to support the revolutions. Unfortunately, however, as we see, sometimes victims of the past become oppressors of the present. The question here, why I say what you're for, is that we saw, for example, in Egypt, it was very easy. The military got rid of Mubarak because he was irrelevant as an individual. It was more about maintaining the survival of the military regime, and therefore they replaced him with Sisi. So the Syrians, it's not about who you're against. It's about what you're for. Are you for freedom? Are you for a pluralistic society? Are you for democracy? And that's what's important, to focus on that rather than focusing on who is the person that's trying to be against you.
Thank you very much. I've learned a lot hearing the three different perspectives. I think this question was originally for Dr. Hosam, but I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has an opinion on it as well. It's a bit of a prickly question. So how much blame do you think can be placed at the feet of the Syrian opposition for how things have played out? And the follow-up to that is, in what shape are they now? They've had 8 years, really. We can make arguments about Assad destroying civil society before, but they've had 8 years now to get themselves in shape. What shape are they in moving forward? Thanks.
How much blame we can put on the Syrian opposition of the current situation in Syria? I guess they've played some role in very specific times, but overall, just imagine that the Syrian opposition were much more lenient towards the international community's proposals, and they did whatever they've been proposed to do. I don't see anything that will change the reality that now we are witnessing. Of course, the Syrian opposition is not great in terms of the political interaction with the international community and so on and so forth, and above all, the relationship between the opposition factions and between them and the Syrian people were not always very good as well. So in that regard, we should blame them. If we've had a political leadership that all the opposition were rallying behind that, I guess that would be at a certain point in time a game changer. However, because I was part of the negotiations, we had many arguments and many debates inside the opposition about every step we took at the time of negotiations. But I'm just imagining that we did. There was always proposal from the international community and from the special envoys and from the representative of the UN. Sometimes we were lenient towards having more interaction with them. Sometimes we did not want to give up or to give any concessions without having the price. If we did everything that we've been asked for, that would not change anything, because the other party, the regime and the Russians, were very stubborn, and they did not want to have a meaningful negotiations to start with. In 2014, we had some discussions, some sort of political discussions inside the chamber of negotiations, but that lasted only for 2 rounds, and not always there were discussions. Most of the time, Bashar al-Jafari was yelling at the other party and using all bad words that you can imagine. At that time, Aghdar Ibrahimi made some very clever movements and make the other party listen to the steps of political transition in Syria. But that's it. So I don't think we can blame the opposition too much of what had happened. So we have still the coalition, the Itilaf is based in Istanbul, and it's still the umbrella of most of the opposition groups and factions, and we still have the HNC or the negotiation committee that followed the HNC. It's based in Riyadh, but we don't have a negotiation. So the HNC or the negotiation committee is not doing negotiations. So it's just a collection of intellectuals and politicians that they do the debates on between now and then. But the coalition is still there, but it has very minimal role in terms of how political things are moving.
I mean, the opposition, sort of in the broadest sense, is up against a lot, right? It's not just Bashar al-Assad. In December, we had the Doha Forum here, and we had this panel on justice in Syria and Palestine and Yemen. And one of the speakers was the now former UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura. And we also had Fadl Abdelghani, the chairman of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. And, it was very interesting to see the disagreement on something so fundamental. In the meetings, whether it's in Geneva or other countries where the peace, the sort of negotiations were taking place, you hear this constant disappointment especially from civil society, that sure, they're included in these meetings, they're invited to some of these meetings, but they have no sort of meaningful role in, first of all, setting the agenda, and secondly, their demands, they're very sort of clear demands with regards to whether it's the political transition, whether it's including the language of a political transition in these meetings, or justice are not, they're not always taken into account, or they're dismissed. And so I think, as I said, they're up against so much, and they disagree over these very fundamental issues. So I guess I'm equally pessimistic, unfortunately.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. We come from two European countries, Italy and France, that have been flooded by refugees in the last few years. And we came to this talk because we were interested in the title, What Next? Mrs. Noha was mentioned about future justice. I want to ask where we can find suggestion by international lawmakers how to solve the problem of the foreign fighters' family, because now our daily striking news on our newspaper, on our TV, are regarding accepting or not accepting the wives and the children of this foreign fighter. I think almost 90% of the men are already dead, but the ladies are there, and especially the children are there. So how can we avoid a future atrocity in rejecting these children to come trying to live a normal life? Thank you.
I want to make sure I understood the question. So.
How can European people could be guided, suggested to take the proper decision to accept or not accept the remaining families of the foreign fighters?
Who are citizens of Italy and France?
Of course.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if they're citizens of Italy and France, so you're saying they may pose a threat for justice in the future?
If you read our newspaper, 50% of the population is against, 50% is why not?
I mean, I think if they are citizens of Italy and France, yes, then they have the right to remain in Italy and France. You're talking about the relatives of the foreign fighters.
Wife and children.
Yeah. So, I mean, if they haven't committed any crimes, or if they're not implicated in any crimes, I don't see the problem in having them remain in Italy and France.
The international law is quite clear on this. If somebody has committed a crime outside the territories of his own country, he should be brought to justice and basically in his own country. So if these people have committed any crime, they should be brought back to their countries and be prosecuted there. On the other hand, if we, for example, just rejected them coming back to their country, that they have their citizenship as you suggested, then that is a very clear recruiting sergeant for the future terrorists around the world. So the only answer is to have them back and to try to integrate them in the system, in the education system and cultivation system, and so on. And this is the only thing I can think about.
If you don't mind, I just want to again, here there is a narrative issue, right? I mean, firstly, I don't believe European countries were flooded by refugees, but I would say, to be honest, the Middle East has been flooded by European militaries and colonialist powers for decades. And I think it's important here to note a few things. The reason why many in the Middle East you suddenly found them as migrants or refugees in Europe. As we say, the saying is, or at least as somebody who was raised in the UK, what I would tell people is, I'm here because you were there. So had the British not been in Egypt, my family would never have moved to the United Kingdom. Similarly, particularly France, when we talk about Syria, France has a very important role with regards to Syria, either as a former colonialist power there or also by propping up the regime. And even till now, with all the condemnation that the French may give to the Assad regime, it still continues to help support that. So this is one thing that's very important to understand. When we think about foreign fighters, again, there's a duplicity in how we deal with them. So, for example, in the United States and the United Kingdom, you have many dual British and American nationals who are also Israelis who go and serve in the Israeli army, but there's never a question about what to do with them, even though they commit crimes against international law in terms of occupation and so forth, or even in the wars against Gaza and so forth. But also in terms of radicalization, this word, these people weren't radicalized, those who went to join ISIS or whatever it's called, they weren't radicalized in Syria. They were radicalized in Italy or France or the United Kingdom and so forth, and therefore the responsibility is squarely there also for that to understand. I remember as a student during the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, we very firmly, as people who were anti-war, warned that if this war was to take place, there would be radicalization, that there would be groups that would be preying on young, angry people who would be seeing the injustice. Throughout, whenever I started getting politically involved, we warned that unless there was a solution to the continued illegal occupation of Palestine, that there would be material for young people to be radicalized. There are numerous studies that have been done that prove this. This responsibility is firmly, squarely on Western powers that continue to allow for this to happen. So if we want to solve the root cause of it, we identify the root cause. If we want to talk about migrants coming and refugees as if they came out of nowhere and they suddenly just appeared, then we're never going to solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Jamal on this issue of narrative and the way that the question was framed. And I'm sorry I didn't understand your initial question. But Italy is really a great example of illustrating this. We had a meeting recently with a senior EU official who said, we were talking about this issue of migrants. And he said, this is not about Europe, it's about the Middle East. And it is, in fact, about Europe and the Middle East. And I say that Italy is a really good example of this because of this case that you might know about at the European Court of Human Rights against Italy for supporting the Libyan Coast Guard in intercepting, these boats of migrants in the Mediterranean, bringing them back so that they don't go to Italy, and then having them die in horrible conditions in these detention centers in Libya. And so I think certainly this issue of narrative and how you frame these very crucial questions would then turn everything the other way around and show that it is very much about Europe as well as the Middle East.